Good morning, everybody. I am typing in chat just to make sure you know that I am speaking. So if you see the chat and you don't hear me, then maybe check some of your controls for me. But out of respect for your time, it is straight up 10:30 in the morning, so we are going to start. And I just appreciate everyone being here. I will tell you that normally I do have a breakout session, but this is a very small group, so we'll be able to just do the activity together. We will have some polls, but we won't need to break out. And so you're not missing anything. We're still going to do the activity, but just wanted to let you know. So thank you very much for coming to Aligning Content and Learning Objectives. The idea is that this will fit in somewhat with the metacognition piece that you heard from Mary Helen, as well as with guided pathways. So there is a link that I have in a Google folder. I don't expect you to write this thing down. I will email you any activity that we do, as well as any supporting documents that I've come up with to help you after our time together today. So you don't need to write that down. I will email you everything as well as the link, so you always have access to it. The only thing that I ask is that you remain muted unless we're all speaking together in the group, just because sometimes there's feedback. I know I've shut my office door to keep the dogs from barking, to, just to keep that kind of noise down. But when we get to what would have been the breakout, I will ask that everyone unmute themselves. I think you've probably seen this 1,000,001 times already. This is just our Zoom bomb action plan. If it happens, which it hasn't happened to me yet, knock on wood, just turn off your video if you have it on. Please mute your microphone. We won't be in breakout, so you don't need to worry about that. We'll discuss if we need to exit the session or if I've been able to boot people out. So we're going to get started. So instructional alignment is about content, activities, and assessments aligning and making sense to everyone. That doesn't mean just students. That's you and anyone who might come in your course behind you. And so I like to say that it's more about just drilling and testing so that we can assign a grade. There should be something in your makeup of your system that provides feedback about student learning. So we're going to talk about Bloom's taxonomy, the revised version. We're not going to do a deep dive. I'm not going to bore you to death with the history of all of that, but we will use that in consideration of alignment. And you could do this with any taxonomy to improve learning. That's just the one that I'm going to use today. So in order to do this, we need to be able to write observable learning objectives, and we'll talk about what observable means. A lot of you, I'm sure, already know, but it's be just a nice little refresher for everybody. And then choose formative content that supports those particular learning objectives, and then the assessments that would accurately assess the content that you taught, because that ultimately leads to the content and the assessments all being aligned back to the learning objectives. So it's, a multi-step process. And when activities and assessments are aligned with your objectives, that truly is the alignment that we're always talking about with QM and anything like that. So we are going to do a quick poll. It is anonymous, so you can be completely honest. It shouldn't take us long because there aren't too many of us. But it's just your feeling about learning objectives. I know people love them, hate them. There's a variety of ways that people go at it. So if you could just answer that for me. And again, like I said, it's anonymous. So if you really want to say that they're absolutely pointless, feel free. So most of you say you use it to guide your course, which is super nice. I'm very grateful for that, and I'll stop sharing those results. And in the poll, which I always forget to end the poll. I don't know about you guys, but I do that a lot, it seems. All right. So, back to my whole little alignment graphic. Alignment is that connection between the objectives, the activities, and the assessments. And it really does mean that all of those things match up so that students learn exactly what you intend and that you accurately assess that, so that we don't get the whole, nothing that we talked about in class was on the test, nothing that I read, I wasn't judged on any of that. So it kind of helps with that too. But if the objectives are the expectation for student performance, we do need to be able to verbalize that in a way that makes sense to students, in a way that they know what they should be able to do or know when they finish the course. And if they're written in ways that clearly state that, and it's written using their voice, which I know there's back and forth on that, and a lot of times people are just like, I really just want it to say student will be able to. But as long as I am an advocate for the I can statements, but I don't think that they're necessary as long as the objective is written in a way that the student could honestly say, I could form that sentence myself. But if we do that, then we're really setting the stage for their success. And good objectives could be referred back to throughout the activities and assessments to show the student how that activity supports what the rest of the course, or how it supports them being successful. So there's not a, why do I have to do this? I'm never going to use this in real life kind of thing. And if we tie those objectives back to the rest of the course, it also shows that learning path, that, that guide, that students can become more aware of their learning and hopefully have a better ability to control, monitor, and regulate the learning, which leads back to the metacognition piece that Mary Helen had talked about. So the activities outside of the objectives, those, that can be content, that could be a thing they do, but it needs to engage the student and help them achieve the intended, back to the learning objective. So, again, I don't mean to make it sound like all students complain about this, but we do often hear that students complain that they didn't feel that whatever they did or were taught or learned didn't prepare them for the test or the assessment. And so, or again, that I'm never going to use this thing again. So if they clearly model that objective goal, then we can inspire the student confidence in the process. And again, that helps keep them engaged, less chance of us losing them. Because if they can see a purpose, and even though I know some of them are pretty young, but they still have started to reach that period where it's more about what does this mean for me kind of mindset. And so if the activity is formative and aligned, then we are providing that student with the tools to be successful in the next piece, which is their summative or more high stakes assessment phase. And that's where we're implementing a system or process to collect evidence about what they know or what they can do. And so it can involve, observing, recording, scoring, all the things that we read about, interpreting that information. But a good system provides enough feedback to the students about what they're learning, about how they're showing what they're learning, that it really provides evidence for what you've determined their grades should be. So it really does support you as well. But beyond giving you the solid argument about the grade that you've issued, we've aligned assessments, and I apologize, something's blooming in my yard and it's making me a little froggy sounding. Aligned measurements, it's what we've told the student that we would measure them on, or that we would teach them. And so their chances for success are drastically improved because we gave them relevant content and formative activities to support all of that content and prepare them for the assessment. And we are measuring what we said we would, and hopefully that means that we are measuring what we taught. So why is it really important? Because it does keep us going in the right direction. When all of this is related back to a good, well-written learning objective, the assessments accurately measure the student learning, and it's easier for them to hit those targets. And if all of your things aren't in alignment, beyond creating some vagueness, it can actually make your course kind of fragmented and ineffective. Students receive mixed messages about what they should learn, which is the frustration piece. And where sometimes maybe we lose them, they go off, they overcut, you know, or they might be spending time on stuff that really doesn't lead to what you want them to do or to know. You know, they're trying really hard. They're investing their time. They're not just not doing it. It's just that they're doing the wrong thing. Or on your end, you can overestimate or underestimate the effectiveness of your instruction. So, you know, even though we've got this kind of enduring thing we've written, there's flexibility for you that we'll talk about where, you know, you might need to change things up a little bit or pivot because you're realizing that something's not going exactly as you plan. So if we know that it's important, how do we do it? I mean, you know, one way is to use the taxonomy. I was talking about it. And this is gonna, and I'm not gonna lie, you know, this is a lot of theory that we talk about today. We do some practical application, but it's harder in real life than it is on paper. Some people just have a knack for it. So if you're one of those folks, good for you. You know, you don't have to, you just kind of can see it and do it. But a lot of people really have to work at it. And so, as I mentioned, you know, there's a number of taxonomies out there, but Bloom's is pretty much the most common one. And we're going to use the revised one because, you know, it moves from the simple to the complex or the concrete to the abstract. And I think it's just a classification system that works easy for what we want to do. So again, I told you I wouldn't bore you to death with a history or, you know, a class on Bloom's because that's not what this is. But this is just a quick recap of what happened when they revised it. And you notice that the wording is a little different in the pyramid than in the original one. It was revised in the 90s by a group led by Lauren Anderson, and who was one of Bloom's former students. And so I just think this is a more useful tool for planning curriculum instruction and assessment than perhaps the old one, which is a little more bulky. So we're going to talk about just a few things about learning objectives. And I don't normally like to drink in front of you guys, but this frogginess, so I'm going to have a little sip of water. We're going to talk about learning objectives and what makes a good one and, you know, how they kind of fit into this whole thing. So for every program of instruction, course or training activity, you know, it should begin with a goal. And the goal can be broken down into specific goals, which are actually the learning objectives. And those should be the concise statements about what students will be able to do when they complete their instruction. So it's important because it guides your choices. So when everybody who said they used it to guide their course, I mean, you were right on it. You know, well-defined and articulated objectives are important to provide students with that clear purpose. And again, I keep harping on this, but it helps focus their efforts, and it directs your choice of instructional activities and guides the strategies you're going to use for assessment. And I only bring this up because it comes up from time to time. A lot of people know the difference, but sometimes the waters get muddied. There is a difference between a learning goal and a learning objective. And a goal, that's the little bigger thing. That's what you hope to accomplish in the overall course. Your overall goal doesn't necessarily result in observable or measurable behavior, whereas a learning objective is a brief, clear statement that does result in something we can observe and we can measure. And so again, it's about what students can do or what they can show us that they know. You know, measurable means something objective, like define, identify, defend, compare. Avoid verbs like understand or know. I mean, those are great things for people to do, and that can be part of your goal. And that is part of the taxonomy cognitive areas, but we can't measure if somebody understands or if somebody knows something without using a more actionable verb. And each objective really needs one verb. And we have all either been subject to this or done it ourselves. I mean, I've been guilty of it a million times. We really love, like, a good example is compare and contrast. we really should break it out into two, and I know that that gets to be long-winded. It looks like there's a wall of text, but the problem there, if you have two verbs, what happens if the student only does one of them? I mean, certainly you can have a rubric for certain activities, but talking about your overall learning objective, if there's two verbs, how do you assess if they only do the one? So they always like to compare, but they never like to contrast for some reason. So it is better if you can split that out. And then just as far as your course level objectives, as opposed to your individual lesson ones, ensure that the verbs and that course level objectives are at least at the highest level in your lesson objectives that support it. Because you can't verify that they can evaluate something if our lessons only taught them to, say, define something. So just kind of keep that in mind. You know, that there needs to be alignment, course objectives and lesson or module objectives. Those individual ones from the lesson, they should logically roll up into the course objective. So like I said earlier, it's a lot easier said than done, like almost everything we do anymore. But the most important and challenging aspect of writing those objectives is defining that observable behavior that we can measure. So again, you know, learning and understanding, those are really good instructional goals, but they're just not measurable when articulated that way. So that's just a better way to keep in mind. It's really easy to fall into the understand because we know what we mean by it, but it just needs to be a little more clear. So this would have normally been our breakout, but again, you know, there's not enough of us. I don't want to do that, and so I am going to pull up the activity on my screen and we're just going to do it together. So and I'll type in it so nobody has to go out to the document, but I will send you copies again after probably Monday or Tuesday. I usually get to it first day. So if everybody could unmute themselves, I'll be honest with you, as much as I try with Zoom, I know I can mute everybody, but I always, whenever I try to unmute people, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So welcome everybody. Hey, thanks for coming. So the first one is highlighted because obviously it's the easiest one, so it's our example. But just to give you an idea of what you would have done, you know, how I had this in mind. The first column is the before learning objective. The middle one is where we're going to list what we think the problem with it is, and the after is where we'll just write something quick. I mean, it doesn't have to be this beautiful learning objective for the moment. It's we'll just, you know, the idea is that we kind of start it and get there. And I will tell you, I pulled these from various, you know, articles and documents and things, and there's one that if you gave it to me outside of preparing for this conversation, I would have said it's fine. So I will tell you, if there's one that you say there is no problem, I'll buy it. And then I'll tell you what the reasoning that other people have about why it's not fine. And we won't need to debate it for hours. I'm always very transparent in that everybody doesn't always agree on stuff. Even so, there we go. But the first one is describe and create a marketing plan for your organization. So what do we think might be wrong with that one?
Two action verbs.
Exactly. So it has two verbs. Like I said, I'm not going to write these big long things. So having those two verbs could result in that split objective idea I talked about earlier, where potentially the student could maybe describe a good marketing plan, but not create one, or vice versa. You know, sometimes they get so caught up in the more exciting thing of creating something that they forget to do the easier part, and then they haven't done it. So what do you think you would want? Somebody can just holler out.
The first part is just to describe it.
Yep. So we would probably have describe a marketing plan.
Yeah.
And then,
Yes.
you know, a second one, might be create. And, that might be, later down. But so I agree. Just splitting them out takes care of that problem. So thank you very much. So the next one, become familiar with the elements of editing.
I mean, what does familiar mean?
Exactly right. How do we measure that? That's not a measurable verb at all. So, because the student could always say, but I read some stuff, I'm familiar with it, I just can't talk to you about it. So, we'll just say not measurable. And then maybe, there's a lot of different ways to go with this, with us not being familiar with the, the content surrounding it, but what might be something we could ask them to do, since it's elements of editing? I can give you a hint. Maybe, they might need to just be able to list elements. It could be as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
List or identify, depending on where we are in the course, maybe they need to edit a document, actually do it. So they could list or identify, use elements of editing. And when I say use, obviously there would have to be a lot more information before I actually hit that period, because how are they using it? Obviously they're going to probably edit a document or edit an infographic or something like that. So complete the assignment.
It's incomplete.
I'm sorry?
They can fail the assignment and make that requirement.
That's right. So what that means, what you're really saying, is that's not even a learning objective, because that's something that they do. It's so it's an activity that we don't have any measurement on, that we're not measuring based on that verb. I hate to use the term good. That sounds terrible. So that's more like I said, a to-do item list. It would help support, maybe the assignment would help support whatever we're doing. So I wouldn't even rewrite that one. I would just leave it. I would not include it.
Could you salvage that by requiring a specific score?
I don't really feel that would meet it. I think instead, whatever they're doing in the assignment would really be more of the objective. So let's pretend that complete the assignment really related to properly use elements of editing to correct errors in this document. That would be more of it, because it's giving them something to do. Not to say that you can't require that they get a certain percent to move on to something else. We do that a lot with the more corporate continuing education side. You need 80% or something, and we used to do that a lot in K-12, especially for credit recoveries. You had to get a certain score before you can move on. But that's more of a requirement as opposed to, I think, a true objective. That's a good question. I appreciate you asking. So this next one, explain the benefits of various exercise modalities for an elderly person. And remember, I mentioned earlier that there was one that I didn't hate.
But that would either be, well, I just don't like explain, because that's not really explain what. Explain the benefits, okay, but that's too broad to me.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny that you say that. A lot of people, I say a lot, y'all are the third one. So in both of the previous groups, a lot of people did feel that even though there was a measurable verb, that it was too vague. So, I will certainly
Subscribe or something?
buy that. But this is the one that I said, it's really not terrible because
No.
they do have to somehow, whether we're having them write something or do a presentation, they're going to have to explain something that we've told
Right.
them. So the experts say that this isn't student-centered, that it's more something that you would do, that you would explain to them, and they would somehow employ it later. I disagree, but I wanted to put it out there just to show that there's always going to be disagreement, even on something that seems so straightforward. But their suggestion was to determine the most appropriate modality for an elderly person. And I agree that that is a much better one. I'm not denying that. But by the same token, if a subject matter expert or instructor brought me, explained the benefits, I don't know that I would argue. I can't hate that one. So, so I agree. But I do agree it's a little vague and it could be better, but I also don't think it's terrible. And then the last one, formulate a management plan. I think I accidentally got rid of plan for each of the above.
What is the above?
Very good. Obviously, it was probably intended to be the third or fourth on a list of other objectives, but they should stand alone. So, so all you would do is, rewrite it to whatever, like, what are they going to do? They're going to develop that management plan for, the four most commonly found greenhouse pests or something related to a certain plant if we're in a botany class or something like that. So very good, guys. I appreciate your work on that. I will save what we did, and when you get it, you'll still be able to reuse it if you ever wanted to show it to anybody else. Can you see the PowerPoint again where it says activity?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. When I break out, sometimes, I know we didn't break out, but sometimes when I break out, it doesn't come back, and I'm just yapping along and nothing's happening.
Exactly.
It's like, it's so easy. Everybody keeps saying, oh, all this is so easy. No, it isn't. And I know it's been rough, guys, with COVID, and I know you've all really worked hard. And so I know you hear it from other people, and I'm literally nobody. But thank you for everything that you have been doing lately. So that was just about if we had broken out. And I do promise you, I give a break in a little bit. But we are going to look at some boring graphs for a little bit. Because this is what you can use to plot your course. And this will be in the follow-up materials that I email you. So you don't have to try to draw this or anything like that. I'll give you all of this.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is kind of the overview. So the Bloom's Revised Taxonomy, it provides us a way to define those objectives and plan instruction and choose assessments. But it combines original levels of learning, across the top, so like remember, understand, apply, etc., with types of knowledge down on the left, which are factual, conceptual, procedural, and the metacognitive. And you're like, well, that's pretty, but how does that help me at all? So as I've mentioned, we want to align it, and the table here, this will give us a way to plot objectives, activities, and assessments within these boxes to see if we're approaching the course systematically and effectively. It'll help us kind of focus on our learning objectives and select assessments. So it's just a tool, and we're going to go through it level by level. So the process, the cognitive process across the levels that we were talking about across the top, they go from simple to the most complex. And so that first one is remember, which we all know. That's like recognizing or recalling relevant knowledge, facts, or terms. That's like they can list or they can describe maybe. The next one would be understand, for constructing meaning from that. So that they need to remember or know something before they can understand the thing and make meaning out of the thing. Then they hopefully will be able to apply it. So use the idea or the concept to solve a problem. And then hopefully we'll move on to analyze, where they break something down into components, and they can see the relationship and that overall structure. Hopefully that'll start to make sense to them. And evaluate, where they would make judgments based on the criteria and the standards that they've learned. So as opposed to even just seeing the structure, they can make some kind of truly evaluation. They can make a judgment. And then, the last one is create, where they're going to reorganize the stuff and take the different elements to form a new pattern or a new structure. And then that knowledge dimension side over on the left, that's just the types of knowledge that might apply. So these range from concrete to abstract, but you don't necessarily have to look at them in terms of complexity, because it could be a factual piece of knowledge, but it could be very complex. So, for example, learning a procedure or skill that doesn't require a mastery of all related facts and concepts could occur. So, maybe they learn how to draw blood, but they don't have to understand all the physiology behind that. They have to know how to draw that blood out properly. And then the metacognitive piece at the very bottom, that's how well they know what they understand, knowing their understanding. And that can be done at any level. So it had to go somewhere, but, it's, again, they're not necessarily ranging in complexity. So it helps to keep in mind the relationship between knowledge dimension, such as the factual, to the types that support it, such as basic elements about a subject or what the knowing is. So in that case, the student knows that. They like the meaning, they know something factual, like a term or some vocabulary. But in conceptual, that's the what and the why. That means that they kind of know principles and generalizations. And the procedural dimension is more of the how. Like, they should be able to perform a skill or a method, and the knowing how is part of that procedural. And then the how to know, that goes again to that metacognitive piece, which means that they're aware of their own learning, and they're controlling it and monitoring it and regulating it pretty well on their own. And they can do that at any level. They could do that with very basic factual knowledge. They could say, I'm not getting this. And maybe they've become metacognitive aware enough that they can understand why, so they have to, but that is a piece that can be done at any point. These are just cute little screencast videos showing how some people do plot their course. Like, they'll put the assessment over here, and it goes so fast, and I apologize. But what happened basically is everything ended up in the same square, so we said it was aligned, but I will promise you that later, and it keeps playing, I'm sorry, stop. We will talk about when they don't all end up in the same cell, because sometimes they don't need to, but we will talk about that. So I don't want people to think, oh, gee whiz, they've all got to end up in the same cell. So again, I don't try to soft sell it, and then I'm not trying to oversell how hard this is, but I just want everyone to be comfortable in the fact that it can be more difficult than it appears. And so when you think about plotting those, that's when you're doing kind of your own complex cognitive process thinking. And generally, when objectives, activities, and assessments are in the same cell, that alignment is achieved, like I was saying. But in practice, sometimes they do not and should not always line up in the same cell. So after we take a break in a minute, we'll talk about aligning all of that and show you sometimes when they don't occupy the same cell and why not, and why that's okay. And I will tell you that it's a harder piece to understand or to do. You know, honestly, if they all end up in the same cell, then you're comfortable and you're like, yeah, nailed it. So it's certainly all right if with your content they all end up in the same cell consistently, and that's how you do it, then you know you're nailing it. But the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And so you'll be creating yet that own path for yourself. And, you know, so think about it that way, that it's easier in the beginning for students, and it's easier, harder in the beginning for students, and gets easier, and it's the same way for you. So it is 11:06. If you want to break out, let's say to 11:15, that's 9 minutes, it's almost 10. It gives you a second to run to the bathroom. I'll get some more water, some won't frog at you. So we'll be back in just a few. All right, so it's 11:15, and again, in respect for everybody's time, so we can get done either on time or hopefully a little early, I'll start back. So this is just kind of an example of the plotting, and we're going to get into some more detail. So there's some natural progressions that I wanted you to kind of note here. Some cognitive processes have those natural associations with the type of knowledge. And some ones that kind of come to mind are remember and factual. I mean, if it's a fact, you hopefully can remember it. Understand and conceptual, and apply and procedural. But if you're teaching in one of these dimensions, you should also assess its cognitive processes in other ways. So other cognitive processes, analyze, evaluate, and create, are more generalizable. And I always struggle with that word. I need to find a different one to put there. I guess I'll say they're just more general. So if students are learning factual knowledge, you should assess their ability to remember that knowledge. And then if they learn concepts, assess their understanding. So kind of, you know, in this earlier piece, definitely they're kind of a stepping stone. And as we've mentioned, you know, metacognition is that awareness of your thinking and your learning. And so it's important because it involves the mental strategies that we use to learn and to solve problems. So metacognitive knowledge is also self-knowledge of our own strengths and weaknesses. And that's, you know, our understanding of how we learn best, or how well we can take tests, or what motivates us to learn. And so it is critical to the learning process. And so discussing those learning strategies with students and making learning more visible is beneficial and constructive. So that's why it's kind of browned out altogether across the entire set. So over here on the 4 to 6, where we're analyzing up to creating, you know, if we're trying to incorporate objectives and activities and assessments for that more complex end, those processes facilitate the retention from those previous cognitive processes, which makes sense. So let's say, for example, you have a student who's evaluating a procedure, and that facilitates their ability to recall and understand. So teaching them to analyze a fact or concept has the same effect. So this is kind of leading up to when maybe everything doesn't end up in the same square. But again, we'll keep going. And again, my happy little screencast films, I love them, but I do recognize that they go really quickly. But this one's not as bad. And this one's just saying that to accomplish that one objective, you may need more. You may need to provide 3 activities in different cells. Because like I was saying earlier, maybe they're analyzing something, but they sure do need to understand and apply before they can analyze. And then they might end up evaluating from it. So you can use the table to plot all of that. And, you know, sometimes they plot around and not necessarily in that same square. So I don't want everyone to walk away with either, oh, it can be everywhere, or it all has to be in the same square. Like a lot of things in life, there's some gray. And so, you know, you need to do what needs to be done to accomplish the particular learning objective. And so we'll talk about that a little further. And again, it always replays on me. So this is big, and it's a lot of text. And I will send it all out to you at the end. This is part of what will be in the packet. But here's the idea of how we would break down a persuasive writing for a historical issue. So for the learning objective, it's around explaining the effects of England's taxes on the colonies in 1760 to the 70s. And they're asked to research facts of the historical context and write a persuasive editorial article from either viewpoint. So if we break it down, the objective plotted, that doesn't mean this is the correct wording for the objective. This is plotted on that scale where the first level is understand, so that you want them to understand conceptual knowledge, which is the effects of England's taxes. And then their objectives that falls from that is, and I know not everybody likes explain, but explain or list or describe the effects of England's taxes on American colonists in the 1760s to the 1770s. So that's how, if we plotted it and understand, we can move to an objective that's measurable. And so we plotted it as understanding conceptual knowledge, and that's the effects. And then we've got the objective here was where we wanted them to understand some stuff, but they had to remember first. And then they're going to analyze it for this persuasive argument. So there's some activities that build further out, and it can be argued that writing that essay from another point of view, they're creating something new. I mean, they might not. They might just be researching the views that people held back then and rehashing it, and, you know, not stealing it, not plagiarizing, but, you know, providing that information in ways that say this would have been how they thought. That's not necessarily create, but it could lead to that. And so this is just an example that illustrates that incorporating higher level processes can facilitate student learning. And remember that the activity obviously can have more than one objective. I mean, that one objective of explaining the effects probably only applies to part of this, and you probably got way more objectives that are coming down that are leading to this. And so then we are going to talk about choosing the best assessment types, because there's no single type that provides a complete picture of student learning, and choosing the right one or right combo gives you a more accurate measurement of how close they are to achieving the objective itself. And so we're going to review some general concepts of assessments and look at a few different types, and then we're going to, you know, kind of link some that might make sense to your college. But we're going to look at objective tests, essays, concept maps, and projects and performances. But first, we're going to do one more quick poll. And I'm going to leave this up just so while the poll's running, even though it'll probably be in front of it partly, it's there for you to see. And again, I got a launch poll. And so this one is actually, it's a little more like a activity. I just did it in a poll form so you could read it and take your time, because there's some text up there, but tell me what you think would be most appropriate. Most everybody picked the short answer quiz question, where it's almost like a, you know, a short little essay, but it's just a short response. And I would argue that that is probably the better one, since we're wanting to support it by them discussing a point of view for the energy policy. I can understand why we might have picked multiple choice followed by the policy points. So there's always opportunities, to bring your personal knowledge in or to assess it. But I tend to agree with the group, so I'm going to close that. And so first we'll talk about types. And guys, honestly, I do know you know this, but you know how it is. We just kind of want to refresh and remind ourselves that there's formative and summative, and that the formative are done before or during instruction, such as a pretest or midterm assignment, which helps, kind of set a base where the student is at that moment in relation to the learning goals. And it provides feedback for them and for you, where adjustments could either be made in instruction or how the students are approaching the instruction. And it gives students, again, that focus on where to put their effort and their time. And then summative, it's usually done at the conclusion, and I hate the way that that's worded generally, just in general, the way that, and my grandma would say, hate is such an ugly word. I don't like the way that it always sounds like it's the final exam or the final project. I mean, it could be at the conclusion of a module. I mean, so I very much understand that there are multiple opportunities for summative assessment, so please don't think I mean it as in just that one big, huge midterm and final kind of assessment. But that's where we're really judging the quality of their skill or their knowledge, and it provides evidence that helps us judge their learning and then for you to adequately assign a grade. So I'm going to talk about different things, this objective test first, which we're all familiar with, but just the Center for Teaching Excellence wanted me to mention that at some point later, either in the semester or next semester, we're going to be offering a workshop on alternative assessment types, which I will discuss. So just know that if you like it and you're interested, there will be at some point, I know COVID, we all feel like everything's coming or going to be later, but there will be some additional talk about that if you like it. But first we'll talk about the thing we all know about, which is an objective test. And this is tried and true. It's a really good form to assess. It can be used for formative or summative, and you can have selected response or constructed response. They're really convenient, and they're generally easy to administer and score. So and it allows you to focus on several specific topics. So I always like to say, like, if correct spelling is really important, it's part of the objective, like midterm or a foreign language course, then an objective test can specifically target that objective better than a presentation, because obviously if they're presenting, you may or may not see any sort of spelling, because I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. But the drawbacks are that they focus on the more simple cognitive processes generally, like remembering and understanding. Now, I know we can write scenario-based ones, but just we're talking in a general sense at this point. And it compartmentalizes learning and requires students to perform out of context. It's this question. And it can be subjective. Now, I know it's literally called an objective test, and that means the scoring can be objective, but the creation of the test can be a little subjective, and it can be based on individual perspective. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. And so I talked earlier about selected response versus constructed. So selected are things like the multiple choice, the true false, and the matching. And then constructed are more like the fill in the blank or the short answer, or even in math, show your work. So that just kind of helps you kind of understand what those two different responses are. And then they're typically used, again, for remembering and understanding, but if they're constructed properly, they can also assess a more complex cognitive process, such as applying, analyzing, or evaluating. And that's where I was talking about writing. The ones that are more scenario-based, where there's a best answer versus only a single good answer. And writing test questions that assess at those levels requires a lot of time, skill, and creativity. And for those questions, you need to incorporate, you know, like text and quotes and data and charts, maybe maps or equations. That's where they're going to be able to draw on that information and maybe interpret or draw a conclusion or evaluate. So I'm not saying they're not worth the time, they certainly are, but they do take more time. And so as a general rule, they are more commonly used down in the remember and understand, and they're pretty effective down there. So the blue shading shows where the tests are most frequently used, and I've just put the orange circle over that. So apply, analyze, and evaluate. Can be done, but it's just harder, and so that's why they're gray. And then and obviously it'd be a little harder to create, so that's not even in the gray. And then tips for assessing procedural knowledge, specifically using this type of test. The objective test can assess the prerequisite knowledge shown in the blue, but they generally do not assess the skills in the procedural when it's paper pencil kind of thing, unless it involves like a mathematical problem or a spreadsheet or a map. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then essays, I think we're all familiar with those too. And I do like to emphasize here that essays don't necessarily mean write me a 5-page report with 1-inch margins using MLA. This can be an essay question, you know, or, you know, it's a little more than short answer on the objective test, but don't just think of it in terms of this big, long, humongous paper that the students have to write, don't want to write, and you don't want to grade. But the beauty of these is that they allow students to demonstrate their ability to understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, all the way up to create. And they can vary in length from the short paragraphs, like I was saying, to a lengthy paper. And it can incorporate different styles, like descriptive or informational. They can do persuasive or you know, argumentative type work. And they can evaluate stuff or do critical writing. And so they're a nice flexible tool that can be tailored to assess almost any type of knowledge or process. And they can be combined with objective tests, either as the short answer essays or as, you know, part 2, like they do a bunch of objective tests and then they have to do the separate, more in-depth multi-page manuscript. And so use this when you want students to be deeply engaged in the subject and to apply some of that more complex processing. And to write an essay, because, you know, they need to be able to evaluate that information, analyze the concept, and then present it creatively and logically. So again, you know, it covers almost everything that we would want to do, and it is super flexible. And it can stand alone. I mean, I keep talking about incorporating it, but that's just to let you know that there's flexibility there. But it can be the 5-page paper that stands alone. So I don't want to give the impression that that's not valid. The thing here, when you use an essay, that I really want you to keep in mind is that you need to be clear about your expectations on how you're going to grade it. So you may need to use a rubric. Don't underestimate your time that this takes. It's not just about student time. Your health and well-being are extremely important. And essays are going to take a lot more time. So you have to allow yourself time for it. Make sure you have time. If you have 5 sections, you know, maybe it does need to be the slightly longer than a short answer question on a quiz, you know, not a 5-page essay from every student. You have to make those decisions. But, you know, meaningful feedback is crucial. It helps students progress and get better. And again, consider incorporating them into the objective test. And that's, honestly, that's really for your benefit and for the students too, because it helps them, you know, have diversity in the test, and it just helps you from a standpoint of time. And so here, you know, they can be used to assess that wide range. And the blue is where it's the most effective. It can be done in the gray, kind of like earlier. You know, blue is common, most effective. Gray can be done, takes a little more effort. Because sometimes, you know, like a skills test for procedural is probably better. Some sort of direct observation like clinicals or a presentation, something like that. But that's not to say you couldn't do it in an essay. So there's that. And then concept maps. Oops. I'm sorry, guys. I get excited with my little rolly ball sometimes, and then it just kind of goes crazy. So concept maps. They encourage, you know, this deeper understanding. They allow for complex and critical thinking. They stimulate this deep understanding or long-term memory. And I don't like for people to think I mean simply like bubble maps or thought maps. These can be used to show that they either can identify things, they can class things, they know how things are supposed to be organized. They're often used for anatomy, but it can integrate new knowledge with an existing cognition. And the application here again is it can be formative or summative, and it provides a literal picture of what the student knows and what they know how to do. So just recognize that we don't all structure concepts the same mentally. So it allows for individual interpretation. Unless that thing, you know, doesn't allow for that. I mean, the lung will never be the heart. You know, it can't do the heart's function. So, you know, certainly there are times when that's, you know, your own view on it's not going to work. But if it allows for it, it is kind of one of those nice things where it kind of fits into UDL, and it allows for multiple forms of representation, interpretation, etc. When we're dealing with concept maps, they can be very directed, somewhat directed, or undirected, much like our lives. You can use a directed concept map for things that, again, like I was saying, you know, they can't, it's not up for interpretation. You know, like they label items or they draw lines from one relationship to another. Somewhat directed kind of combines the two things in a way, but it kind of lists concepts and relationships, but maybe there's no structure or line to it. And then undirected, the student is constructing their own idea like that. So this might be in the creation piece, you know, where they're structuring things using their own concepts. But when you grade concept maps, you can use a simplified rubric versus a big massive one, or a point system for each key element, like a checklist. So in some ways, it almost, you know, I know that it can feel like, oh, for grading, it's going to be as bad as an essay, but actually it's the rubric or checklist would make it a little bit quicker for you. And so the directed concept maps kind of fall down there in the lower ones, like objective tests, where they're most effective or they're used most often. And then the undirected, you know, kind of go up to these higher levels. And because they can encourage those complex critical thinking concepts. But, you know, that's the nice thing. If you like them, or you want to try something different, it's a way to assess at a variety of levels. So just know that it's there for you. And then projects and performances. And this is more of the alternative type that I was saying we could discuss, you know, later whenever, you know, general PD gets back on its legs. But also, I think concept maps falls under that. So we would probably discuss that as well. But projects are products that the students create, and it can be a performance or a presentation. And so they're really good ways to kind of double up on learning and assessment at the same time, because it allows them to apply new knowledge and skills in a real world activity while you determine how well they're meeting their learning objective. And so, you know, this is SBS Week. So, you know, obviously, every college now has a wide variety of things going on in it. But, you know, speech presentation, a debate, you could, and these are time consuming, I'm not going to lie to you. if you have to do them in class, like the speech presentations, or if you're setting up a fake debate. But they could also produce a new show or PSA or podcast. You know, things like that are project/performance based, and you wouldn't necessarily have to do them in class. So it depend, that third one especially, like podcasts or quick little videos, you know, they could be submitting those via D2L or something along those lines. But obviously, you know, if they're going to do a speech or a debate, that is going to also eat up some either class time, unless you're doing truly distance and you work it in where they submit it. And again, going froggy, sorry. Submit it through D2L, and anybody in distance learning can help you if you decide that that's something you want to do. And you can certainly do it in your face-to-faces and still have them submit their project through D2L. That's something we can help you with. Oops. So we don't want to talk about STEM today. So, you know, when do we use that? There's a couple of tips on feedback and a couple of tips I have on grading. Feedback is, you know, crucial. Depending on the size of this project, you know, if it's just a quick little, just something they're doing on their own, you're not going to need to do this checking in outside of your normal, you know, normal pulse checking with your students. But if it's something that they're supposed to truly be working on the entire semester, then there's probably going to be, you're going to need to provide some focused and segmented feedback, you know, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever it is you decide, because that helps guide their understanding of the creation and the process versus just this final product that they're getting for a grade, which leads us to grading, which again, clear expectations, and that way you're ensuring validity and alignment, and it should reflect the observable goals from the learning objectives. And you can again use a rubric or a checklist. It is time consuming from the standpoint that a speech or a debate takes a lot of face-to-face time, but the rubric wouldn't necessarily have to be massive, or you could be a checklist. You could easily say they're supposed to hit these certain things, and so when you do that, that's when checklists are really handy. I know a lot of times people get flack for wanting to use a checklist. Checklists are really good when the idea is that they hit certain components along the way. So I don't have any preconceived notion about a checklist. It's just, but sometimes a rubric is more appropriate. And if you ever have questions, anybody in CTE is happy to help you. But project and presentation assessments, they're unique and complex, and so that complexity means that they really have that potential for that wide range of across the processes. And they're actually the only type of assessment that truly assesses procedural knowledge. Again, I know I mentioned that essays can be tweaked to do that, but honestly, procedural, this is the best way to do it. So, yeah, I know this isn't healthcare week, but you know, I always tell people a lot of times it's stuff you might not realize you're already doing. We're not asking you to do something new. Like for them, they do clinicals already, and so that's a presentation. That is procedural, and that could be, if some of you, I'm sure, already do debates or, you know, podcasts or something where they're taking on a role. So it very well could be stuff you already do. But if you are interested in it, you know, anybody's happy to talk you through that. And the good news is that we are finishing up a few minutes early, since we didn't have to break out and do all that good stuff. But just kind of to tell you where you are today versus where we're going, as much as we know right now. Today really was about the theory and the importance behind the aligning those objectives to your activities and your assessments. Over the semester, there's going to be some work on actually doing it. And, you know, at one point we thought CTE would be guiding it, and we still may, we're not sure. It may be something that your deans or your department chairs work with you on. But in anticipation of that, I would just like for you to think about maybe, so it's not overwhelming because there's so much going on, take one lesson or module from a course that you teach or that you know you will, and review your objectives for measurability and observability, and then review your activities and assessments to see if they align, and use the table that I send you if it helps. And so I'll have all those resources for you. I'll also send you the revised Blooms and some examples of, you know, learning objectives that are well written. And, you know, after you've implemented those changes, I think the idea is that there'll be, at some point in our lives, there'll be a third time, and that this will probably definitely be on a college school level, where you will, you know, get together as like-minded individuals and talk about what you did and what went well and what didn't, and kind of help each other and guide each other and say, oh, I can see why that might not have worked. I tried this and it worked really well. So that's just to give you an idea of what is coming, but nothing's set in stone yet as to the when, who, why, and where. So just kind of have it in the back of your mind. Think about, like I said, even if it's just one lesson or one module, how you might change it up so that you'll be ready for whenever that happens. And again, I will email you, so you will have all of this information. You don't have to scribble this down, but if you need my help, or anybody in the Center for Teaching Excellence, you can reach out to any of us, but you will have my email and my signature when I send you all of this. But I will make sure everybody gets credit until noon, but I will hang around for a few minutes if anybody has questions. But otherwise, go live your happy Friday afternoons, and I appreciate everyone coming and being active participants in the activity and participating in the polls. Thank you very much for being here.
I did have one question, so I had to step away for a minute for the AC. I wasn't sure if you covered something on group projects that I missed, like how does that incorporate any of this? To sort of
didn't really talk about them in the concept of groups. What I talked about more was the idea that this is a way for them to show a skill or creative work, and it kind of can be used to double up on learning and assessment. You can certainly put them into groups, because I did talk about this in relation to SBS, in that sometimes maybe they're going to do a debate, and so that's obviously group work. So my biggest concern for everyone, again, kind of deals with time, because you can, the grading doesn't necessarily, as I was saying over here, it could be a simplified rubric just like with the concept maps or checklists, because maybe they need to just hit certain points, but it does take away some of your valuable face-to-face time. So another thing I was mentioning was that you can have them do podcasts or video PSA presentations, so that it's not eating up valuable class time, but they're turning it into you via D2L. And you can do that even if it's a face-to-face class. And if you just ever needed help setting that up, someone in distance learning is happy to help. But as far as group work, I mean, are you asking like ways to kind of manhandle the group, or that's a bad word, you know, like keep them focused, make sure everybody's doing the right thing, or just
right, so that way everyone, I guess in a sense, like everyone's contributing their equal share, and that you the assessment of everyone's, I guess, work.
Yeah,
product.
that is one of the hardest parts about group work. So that's where you have to, that does come somewhat into clear expectations. I mean, one thing that I have found works is that depending on the type of project, so, you know, be very, very judicious in what you are going to make quote unquote group work if it's for a project, and then you can break that project down into components, and everyone has to sign an agreement on what part that, you know, they're producing, and that if there's going to be any changes, then the group has to sign off on it again. So, you know, one thing though I want you to keep in mind, and this is unrelated to learning objectives, group work doesn't always have to be a project. We often think of it that way, but say, and now this is easier for me to put forth if you were doing it in D2L, but you can break the class out into groups and have them every week do a discussion question, and every week a different person is a quote the leader, or you know, or the writer that week. And so it's group work, but they're not, it feels less overwhelming for the students, because they also know that it's going to be pretty clear if somebody doesn't take the reins the week that they do it.
Well, kind of maybe everywhere, I'm thinking along as you're talking, where for the assignment, maybe one person starts it off and the next one may have to build on top of that, so that everybody has built on it and developed the full idea towards the end.
Right. Yeah, kind of like that. So, you know, that's the same concept of like the discussion board, where, you know, somebody, week one, this person starts it, and everybody has to make their reply, their, you know, substantive reply. And then week two, it's person B that has to start, you know, and so you could do the same concept if you needed to do it in a different format. If you didn't want to do it discussion board, but where, yes, you know, each part of it, someone is the leader on that part, and people have to support it. So that's the best way that I know to do it. But just to kind of reiterate though, performances or projects, even in the group sense, don't always have to be like that big thing. Because if you're really looking to teach them the skills of working together, like, yeah, you're going to have to, in the real world, make people do stuff. Sometimes the discussion board really fits and helps there, even if that's the only place you use it, even if it's in the face-to-face, and you're like, listen, this one thing you have to do every week in D2L, and it's this. And to them, it's not going to sound like group work. So you're going to get less groans and moans, you know.
Yeah, I think I kind of do that now. What you're talking about, because for each discussion question, I require them to, because I teach mainly the online courses, to respond to at least 2 of their fellow castmates' posts after they put their initial post. So that way they kind of at least engaging to some extent.
And that's a really good way to create student-to-student interaction. And then, like I said, if you wanted to, like, if you really felt that you needed to emphasize working in groups, you could still have everybody do the same question, but break them out, because D2L will do it for you, into groups, and then they have to do it within each group too, so that they're, and each week you just change who starts the post, kind of deal. Like, here's the reading and the prompt. Mary has to do the initial post and everybody responds to her week 1. Week 2, Tom does, you know, or however. But that's another way to do that without it feeling so group worky to them, because they always complain, I know.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the information, and thank you for the question today.
Well, I appreciate you coming, and like I said, reach out to CTE if there's anything else you need, and that's all you really missed when you had to step away, was that little bit on projects.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, and you have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.